Hello, my name is Emma. Today we will learn about the words Mr., Mrs., Miss, Ms., along with other job titles like doctor, professor, judge, officer, etc. So today we will learn how do we address somebody in English. So to be honest, it can be very confusing for people, whether you are somebody who is learning English or also for native speakers of English. There's a lot of confusion. What do we call somebody? We don't want to be rude, so how do we address them? So I will explain how to address different people in different situations. But first, let's think about these scenarios. When do you use Mr., Mrs., and Miss? So think about when would you use that? Versus when do you use a person's first name? If you met me, what would you call me? Would you call me Miss White, Emma? Would you call me Teacher Emma? What would you call me if you met me? What should students call their teachers? What should students call their professors? What should you call your boss? Do you use your boss's first name? Or do you call him or her Mr. or Miss? What should you call an elderly person? So imagine a 90-year-old woman. Do you call her by her first name or her last name? What should you call your friend's parents? So your friend has some parents, you see them. What do you say to them? Do you call them by their first name or their last name? And also job titles. In English, some jobs have a title. So for example, doctor, professor, judge. So we'll look at which jobs do you use a title and when do you not use a title. So let's better understand these situations because this is something important and it happens a lot. What should we call somebody when we meet them? All right, so let me tell you the general rule and then we'll look at different scenarios. In general, in North America, we are not very formal in the way we address someone. We usually use a person's first name, in general. If you're not sure, what you do is you pay attention to how someone introduces themselves. So if they say, "Hi, I'm Emma," then you use their first name. If they say, "Hi, I'm Mrs. Smith," then you use Mrs. Smith. In general, people use their first name. You can also look at an email. If somebody sends you an email and they sign the email with their first name, use their first name. If they sign the email Mr. or Miss, then use that. And we'll look at more specific examples in a moment. But first, I wanted to look at what the different common ways to address somebody are. So you've probably heard Mr. MR stands for Mr. And then we have a person's last name. So for example, Mr. Trump, Mr. Obama, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Johnson. So these are all examples of people's last names. And we use Mr. specifically with men. So if you hear the word Mr., you know they're talking about a man. So we also have in English Mrs. Mrs. is spelt M-R-S, and it has two syllables, Mrs. And we use this when we're talking about a married woman and we're using her last name. So for example, I had a teacher, Mrs. Todd, or I had another teacher, Mrs. Inglis. Both of these teachers were married, and they both liked to use Mrs. Now, I should mention that nowadays, a lot of women don't use Mrs. It was more common in the past, but nowadays it's becoming less common. You will probably see this more with the older generation than the younger generation. So a lot of women will actually use Ms. So Ms. is MS. And what this means, and again, we have it with the last name, is it means it's a woman, but we don't know if she's married or not, and it's not important. So if you use Ms., it means the main point you're getting across is you're a woman. You're not saying if you're married or single. So you could say like Ms. Let me think of a celebrity. Ms. Swift for Taylor Swift. Ms. Perry for Katy Perry. This has actually become more popular than Mrs. So if you don't know what to call a woman and you want to use her last name, it's probably better to use Ms. than Mrs. We also have Miss. Miss, meaning M-I-S-S. It looks similar to this, but there is 2 extra letters here. We use Miss for young girls. So I might call a student who is maybe 7 years old. If she's a female student, I might say, Miss Jones. Again, it's not being used as much as it used to in the past, but we would use this for a very young girl or a young woman. Like, I would say maybe a child. You might also see this one being used, MX, mix, plus the last name. This is new. I think it started in maybe the 2010s. And so it's becoming common in some countries. Well, it's becoming more used in some countries like England. So you might see this. And what it means is you don't want to say what a person's gender is. So they don't want to say if they're a man or a woman or something else. So they might use MX and the last name. This could become more popular in the future. It's not so common now, but maybe it will be. Who knows? I wanted to also point out that all of these are more formal than using a person's first name. So when you use these, you're either doing it because you really want to show respect and it's a very formal situation. A lot of the times, people feel uncomfortable being called Mr. or Ms. Because they find it too formal and they would actually prefer for you to just use their first name. So let's look at some specific examples of this and figure out what is common in North America. So let's look at the first scenario. You have a boss and you want to know, what do you call your boss? Do you say Mr. Jones or whatever your boss's last name is? Do you say Ms. Jones or your boss's last name if it's a woman or if it's a man? Or do you use their first name? So this is a great question. And again, people get confused with this. But in general, in North America, you would use your boss's first name. At all of the companies I have worked, in many different settings, from education to research to healthcare, I have always called my boss by their first name. So in general, use the first name. If you're unsure, when you first start, you can ask, what should I call you? Do you prefer James or Mr. Jones? And then they can tell you what they prefer. Or another method is see how they sign an email. if they sign an email with their first name, use their first name. Or if they tell you, call me by my first name, call me Emma, call me Scott. Whatever they tell you, do. So many people continue to use Mr. or Ms., but people prefer often for the first name to be used, especially if they say, use my first name. What about your boss's boss or the manager, somebody higher up in the company? What do you call somebody higher up? In general, we use their first name. Again, you can see how your boss talks to them, but usually we use first names in North America. All right, well, let's look at some other situations. A question I get a lot is, what do I call my teacher? I'm a teacher, and so this is a very good question. So what do you think? Should you call your teacher Mr. if it's a man, or Ms. if it's a woman with their last name? Or should you use the teacher's first name? Before I answer this, I just also wanted to point out the pronunciation of MS. It actually has a Z sound at the end, so you'll hear me say Ms. So should you call your teacher, for example, imagine your teacher's name is Steele. First name, Julia Steele. Julia Steele. What would you call your teacher? Well, the answer is a bit complicated because it depends on your age. If you are a child, you would use Mr. and Ms. It's the same with high school students. So if you're in school or high school, you would use Mr. or Ms. So you could say Mr. Steele if it was a man, Ms. Steele if it was a woman. But what about for adults or for college students? Once you are an adult, you would change to the first name. So if you had an English teacher like me, you would call me Emma. You would not use my last name. You would just say, oh, hi, Emma. So you can call me by my first name. It's true with the other teachers. On Ingvid, you can call James by his first name, Ronnie, Jill, etc. Okay, so we are all teachers. What about a professor? Sometimes people call me professor, but that's not correct because I am not a professor. I'm a teacher. The difference is a professor is somebody who teaches at the university or college level, and usually they have a doctorate. So they have a high-level degree in something. So we could call a university, somebody at the university, professor. And you would actually use that word. You would say, Professor Steele. Or you might use their first name, depending on the professor. But usually we would use their last name for a professor at university or college. What about somebody like me? Would you ever call me with the word teacher in front, like Teacher Emma or Teacher Steele? The answer is no. We do not use teacher in front of names. Many people learning English do this. They'll say Teacher James, Teacher Rebecca, Teacher Jill. But culturally, we do not use the word teacher as a title in front of our names. So again, for regular teachers, you just call them by their first name. If you're an adult, if you're a child, you call them by Mr. or Ms. and their last name. All right, so what about in an email? Imagine this situation. You need to write an email to somebody. You know their name, but you have never met them before. What do you do? Do you use Mr. or Ms. and the last name, depending on if it's a man or a woman? Or do you just use their first name? Well, in general, with emails, what most people do is when they communicate with a customer or someone they don't know, they haven't met, they often will start with Mr. or Ms. and the last name in the first email. So they'll say, "Dear Mr. Jones," or "Hello, Ms. Perez." So they often will use the last name in the first email, and then they wait for the person to write back. So when they get the response, then what they do is they look at the bottom of the email to see how the person would sign the email. Do they use their first name or their last name? So what you can do is you can always, if somebody writes to you, once they write to you, look to see after sincerely or kind regards, look to see how they sign the email and use that in the way you address them in the next email. So start formal with Mr. and Ms. and then look at what they do in their email and just follow their lead. If they use their first name in the next email, you use their first name in your email. Okay, here's another common situation that a lot of people don't talk about, but I think it's an interesting one. So you have friends, and your friends have parents, and maybe you go to your friend's house or a wedding or some event where you are talking to their parents. What would you call your friend's parents? Would you call them Mr. and Ms. and use their last name? Or would you call them by their first name? In general, I know for me, I call most of my friends' parents actually by their last names. Mr., Ms. with their last name, until they tell me to call them by their first name. So I have a really good friend whose last name is Knoll. So I call her parents Mr. and Ms. Knoll. If you're watching Mr. and Ms. Knoll, hello. So I would address them by their last name unless they say, "Hey, Emma, please call me by my first name." In that case, I would switch. But they haven't told me to call them by their first name, so I still use Mr. and Ms. So let's look at two more situations. What should you call a really old person? So by that, I mean an elderly person or a senior. What would you call somebody who's 90 years old? Would you call them by their first name? Or would you call them Mr. or Ms. and their last name? Well, the answer is it depends. Some people prefer their first names, and they'll tell you that. Usually what I do is I would use Mr. or Ms. and their last name if I don't know them well. And then they might say, "Oh, please call me Joan," or "Please call me Bill." And then I would use their first name. But often with really much older adults, I would usually use Mr. or Ms. until they tell me to call them by something different. And again, when I'm talking about older, I'm talking more like 80 or 90-year-olds. I'm not talking about 50 or 60-year-olds. There's often a generational difference. Okay, what about jobs? Let's talk a little bit about jobs. There are some jobs where I do use a title. So for example, I already talked about professor. So I called my professors Professor Copeland, Professor Faraday. So I would use professor and their last name, unless they told me to call them by their first name. If there's a judge, I would call them judge and their last name. So Judge Scheindlin, Judge Brown, for example. It's the same with doctors. I would call a doctor by their last name. So Dr. Steves or Dr. Muccelli. So I would use the last name. For police officers, I would also use their last name. So if I met a police officer, I would say Officer Smith, Officer, I can't think of another last name, but Officer Jones. So I would do that until they tell me to use their first name. Same with religious people. So people who are who work in churches or mosques or synagogues or temples, we would use their specific religious title and then their last name. So you might have rabbi and then their name. You might have father if they're Catholic and then the name. Pastor with the last name, depending on the type of Christian somebody is. Or you might have pastor and the first name. That's possible too. You might do the same with imam. So depending on the religion, you often will use the title and then the person's last name. Same with military. If somebody holds a military title, you would use that to address them, especially if you don't know them. This is all different if you're friends or family with these people, but if you don't know somebody and you're talking to them, then you usually would use their titles. So you might call somebody lieutenant or sergeant and their last name, for example. And then it's the same with government officials. You might say Prime Minister Trudeau or President Bush or Ambassador Johnson, Mayor Quimby. So you might use different, you would use the title and then their last name. So we've covered a lot. And the main thing I want you to remember is, in general, first names are what you should be using. There are some exceptions, but in general, in North America, in most situations and contexts, we prefer first names. But if you don't know, you can always ask somebody, what should I call you? What do you like to be called? All right. Thank you so much for watching today's lesson. Titles can be confusing, so I'm glad we were able to look at many different situations and whether to use the first name or Mr. and Ms., depending on the situation. So I recommend you check out our website at www.ingvid.com because there you can find a quiz where you can practice what you learned today. Remember, practice makes perfect. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel. We have a lot of videos on many different topics, including learning English, study skills, pronunciation, and so much more. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care.